Are you confused about the new dietary guidelines for Americans? The food guide pyramid has always caused confusion in the past. So how can we expect an inverted version to be any better? And why is there still this push for 3 servings of dairy a day for good health? Let's talk about these new guidelines and set some things straight. My name is Norma Flood, and I'm an integrative and functional nutritionist. Welcome to Go With Your Gut. I'm going to discuss the pros, cons, and controversy around these new dietary guidelines for Americans that were released by the Make America Healthy Again Commission, which is chaired by RFK Jr. And in their defense, it's not easy to make guidelines that are suitable for the entire population of the United States. Understandably, we each have unique needs, depending on our stage of growth, or if we currently have chronic disease, we have food allergies, we have food sensitivities. So this is not an easy task to take on. So no matter what, it's always going to be left for criticism. But these are going to be some major themes that I really want to discuss today. And first things first, when you open the website for these new dietary guidelines, and that's found at realfood.gov. So on realfood.gov, when you first click on that page, the first thing that happens is you see this green screen, and what pops up is a big head of broccoli, a half gallon of whole milk, and a big steak. So you have these 3 foods that are apparently central to good health. Yet when I think about beef and whole milk, they're not exactly the best foods when it comes to good gut health. Not they need to be avoided, but definitely not a primary source of the nutrition that we need the most. And secondly, what leaves me a little confused is how this inverted pyramid looks. So that's where this website will take you next, is this visual of an upside down food guide pyramid where you'll see icons of all these various foods. And just to take a look at that, if you want to take a look here, you'll see that beef, cheese, and chicken are right up at the very top of this pyramid along with vegetables. And that's a little bit confusing because we think, well, what's supposed to be taking the most room on our plate? Does that mean this beef and cheese needs to be the same portion as our vegetables? And so people are likely going to be confused about that. And so another thing that I notice in this, looking at this pyramid, is the whole milk and cheese have priority over yogurt. Yogurt tends to be a more digestible form of dairy, a healthier form, and it has good microbes. And they're really up there when it comes to importance or priority as part of our diet. So a bit of confusion there. Moving on, taking another look at this pyramid, you can see that butter's right alongside with walnuts and almonds. Whereas we always thought, well, aren't the types of fats in walnuts and almonds like a little more? We might need higher quantities of those versus butter. And then how about those 2 bowls? Like there's one bowl above the line on the pyramid and there's one bowl below. What's in those bowls? Little bit confused there. So overall, the visual lacks clarity. And again, what I talked about before, how we definitely need to be going into these explained guidelines to understand what this pyramid really means. But the majority of Americans will likely just use this visual and stop there. So let's move on to what these actual guidelines are that might explain what this pyramid really means. What I do like in these new dietary guidelines is the Secretary of Health and also the Secretary of Agriculture. They open up with a letter. And if I could read that opening statement, it's actually very good. It reads, American households must prioritize diets built on whole, nutrient-dense foods, including protein, dairy, vegetables, fruits, healthy fats, and whole grains, paired with a dramatic reduction in highly processed foods laden with refined carbohydrate, added sugars, excess sodium, unhealthy fats, and chemical additives. And I do feel that this is a great statement, and really that focus on eating real food, especially knowing that the majority of Americans consume over half of their calories from ultra-processed foods. So if we can get this message out of that, I think that's probably one of the important messages of these new guidelines. But the question is, what are we going to be doing about this? But before I jump into these top principles or food guidelines for Americans, some other things that were mentioned in this initiative was to tackle the list of chemical additives that are generally recognized as safe. So a lot of these food additives that are in that GRAS category, GRAS, and there hasn't been enough research on a lot of these chemicals that are likely harming our health and our microbiome. So that is a good thing. But what you might notice if you want to read through this very long document is they do not include glyphosate. So when we're looking at chemicals in foods, it doesn't start at when a food is processed. It starts when a food is grown. And a lot of chemicals, pesticides are on the foods that we eat, both real food, real whole foods and produce, and our processed foods. And especially glyphosate, like I said, not included on that list. So here's a question, given that Bayer, which is the largest producer of glyphosate, has a pretty strong lobbying power in Congress. Is there some influence there that it was not included on the list? Is there a reason we're not really bringing up the chemicals in foods that come into the system through farming methods? So this is one thing that I feel is being overlooked, especially because all of our wheat, our oats, many beans, legumes, glyphosate is now widespread, and it's a known neurotoxin, and it harms our microbiome. We need to start at the soil. And I talked about this in a previous episode. It does start with the soil. And so they also have plans to address the advertising of processed foods. Well, I think that's great because I think that when we're constantly being bombarded with advertisements of processed food, there's that constant thinking of what they want to eat. Like, it's what I talk about. If you think about chocolate cake, are you going to eat? You're more likely to eat chocolate cake. So it's really about really monitoring the advertising. I will love to see where that goes. And hopefully we see a difference. But also I think this needs to happen on the ground. I don't think just having these guidelines are going to help many Americans. First, because most of them aren't even going to look at these guidelines. But how about what we're exposed to in the grocery store and even what our kids are exposed to? When you check out at the store, that checkout line is always loaded with highly processed foods and candies. And they're especially at eye level for kids. So we're really starting our kids young with this idea that tempting food is okay to include all of the time and on a regular basis. But as we know that statement, out of sight, out of mind, that really is true. And so we really need to take this seriously, even in how food is displayed at grocery stores. It also needs to address our school lunches, because most school lunches are processed and packaged foods, highly refined white flours. This is going to be a big thing to tackle, because it's one thing for this statement to go out about how we need to reduce our intake of ultra processed foods. What are the policies out there to reduce temptation? And this I also talk about on the side, because I work a lot with eating disorders. A lot of times eating disorders are a result of this conflict between what is healthy, yet getting all these messages of what is bad, or that temptation of all of these other foods that might be in front of them versus those healthier choices. So really a lot that could be said about this. And finally, the recommendation for more home cooked meals. Excellent advice, but how can we encourage families to actually follow through with such a practice? They're going to need help. If a family is very busy, which tends to be the case in our culture, where most people are overscheduled, including our kids, how do we learn to make quick, easy, good tasting meals that include whole, healthy ingredients? So there also needs to be a campaign to have access to easy, healthy cooking online, virtually, to families, and encouraging family meals. So this really is, it's going to take a cultural shift in Congress, in our stores, at schools, and at home. It needs to go far beyond what these promises convey in the guidelines. So let's jump into these principles. There's 8 principles that make up these dietary guidelines for Americans that further explain what they're trying to show in this inverted pyramid. And again, we're going to talk about the pros, the cons, and the controversy. So the first one is eat the right amount for you. So the benefit of this is just recognizing that we are individuals. We have different energy needs. Some people need more protein than others. Some people are in a certain disease state that they need to balance their macronutrients a little bit differently. And then also the special populations and considerations, those are included after these 8 principles, but they should make a note in there that, hey, you might want to look deeper on this. And I do think it's great that they also add water. Like, water is such an essential part of health that we completely forget about, but water makes a big difference in your health, physical and mentally. So good start, I would say, overall. But that's just one. Now we move on to principle 2. So principle 2 is prioritize protein at every meal. I do agree that we need protein at every meal because it does break down into amino acids. We need that not only for muscle and tissue, we need it for brain neurotransmitters, we need it for hormone production, we need it for immune factors, and so much more. And so protein also helps with appetite control and blood sugar stability, so that we're not getting a sharp rise in glucose and a fast drop. Really, protein, fiber, fats, they help slow down the digestion of carbs. So it does make up a part of your diet. But when we see it at the top of that inverted pyramid, it seems like, well, gosh, should protein make up half of my plate because it's right up there with vegetables? No. If you want to think of it more from a weight standpoint, maybe the weight of 3 ounces of protein, which might be the size of the palm of your hand or a deck of cards, might be the weight of a 3-cup salad. So yes, vegetables should still be taking up more room on your plate. So don't be confused by the visual of the inverted pyramid. So yes, get protein every meal, but be sure vegetables are the bigger player on your plate. And then also, I think being careful with high protein diets, as I always say, You'll know if you're getting too much protein. You're going to have more constipation. You could have gastric upset. You could have more acid reflux, all of these different things, digestive issues when we get too much protein and not enough fiber in our gut. Because when that happens, we get more inflammation and that spreads throughout the body. That can build up toxins in our gut. So always important to get that fiber and vegetables in to balance out that serving of protein. And as for types of protein, I do agree focusing on keeping it real, all types of protein, having variety, less processed types, overall like chicken nuggets or fast food, all of those kind of sources, really keeping it real and trying more at home. The third principle, again, here it goes with dairy. So as I mentioned, it's interesting that they still promote 3 servings of dairy a day is important for your health. And especially it focuses on bone health. Yet what is interesting is that first food guide pyramid, if you remember, always pushed dairy as well. It was like about 2 to 3 servings a day. And interesting that it was made by the National Dairy Council, or is it the American Dairy Council? It's one of those. But the dairy industry basically was a part of that. And this continues to play an undercurrent, I feel, in this continued push for dairy, where did you know that up to 70% of our world population cannot even digest dairy? Cannot digest dairy. And it's actually a genetic mutation that we can digest dairy, by the way. So I'm not saying dairy is bad. It's just that there isn't this need for 3 servings a day to get your calcium either. I mean, look at cows. They're the big producers of calcium. They eat plants. We can eat plants too. There's a lot of plants like bok choy, collard greens, kale, broccoli, butternut squash, beans, all of these different plants that provide calcium as well. And calcium's absorbed better from vegetables than it is dairy. Dairy, you only consume about 30% of the calcium, and it makes your body just a little more acidic, which affects your absorption as well. And plants are more alkaline, and you absorb up to 50% of the calcium. As long as it's not the high oxalate plants like Swiss chard and spinach, you won't absorb calcium as much from those. So just to be aware. But just know, I think a lot of it is not just the industry, but there's a lot of fear. Like, oh, what about my bones? I got to be sure I get enough dairy. So sometimes it's just really ingrained in us that it's the only way to get our calcium. Yet another fact that I thought I'd share is countries with the highest fracture risk have the highest dairy intake. Highest fractures have highest dairy. And while those with the lowest, like China, have the lowest risk for fractures with the lowest intake of dairy. And maybe we're chasing the wrong thing, because one thing is for certain, that it's inflammation in our gut that really has the biggest impact on our bone health. When you have more inflammation, you increase these cytokines that increase breakdown of bone. And also, you reduce the absorption of calcium, and you reduce the production of vitamin K, which is needed for calcium to go into the bone. You also reduce absorption of other nutrients like iron and so forth. So really know that our focus on the gut, once again, will play that biggest role in our bone health. So plants, double fold here. They play 2 roles. They feed the microbiome, and a lot of them contain a good source of calcium that is absorbed well. And when it comes to dairy, I feel the fermented types are best. Whole milk is very difficult to digest for most people. But if you have more like yogurt, and whole yogurt's good, it's less processed. Same with real cheese, whole cheeses that are more like fermented types, because fermentation helps the breakdown of these proteins and lactose so you can digest and absorb better. So why whole milk falls higher on that inverted pyramid is a little puzzling to me. And then what's crazy as we move down the principles after dairy is listed gut health. So then they mention gut health. Follow these guidelines with an emphasis on vegetables, fruits, fermented foods, and high fiber foods while avoiding highly processed foods, which is true. But it's interesting that they list that right after dairy. And then principle 4, they finally bring up eating more fruits and vegetables. Principle 4. So I feel like that should be up higher on the list, if you ask me, because we need more of those. We tend to lack vegetables and fruits, especially vegetables in our diet. And so the recommendation for vegetables for a 2,000 calorie diet is only 3 servings. I think that falls short. I really think, I know we need more than 3 servings of vegetables a day. So this push for more dairy and not enough push for the vegetables is a concern to me. We really need to be having more vegetables. And then some people might say, hey, wait a minute. What if I have, I'm an athlete, I have really high protein needs, maybe protein should take up more room on my plate. Well, maybe, but also vegetables should be higher too. So as you increase protein intake for your needs, you're also going to need to increase the vegetables. So if I'm an athlete, I need that higher protein, but I also need more antioxidants. I need more micronutrients. I need more fiber. So with that higher protein, vegetables are still taking the majority of the room on your plate. Now, obviously, if you cook 3 cups of greens, they turn into this little pile on your plate. So there's some exceptions there. But just knowing that the servings of vegetables should be greater than your servings of protein, regardless of how much you need. So let's keep taking care of the gut. And definitely at least 2 fruit a day is an important thing to remember as well. Moving on to principle number 5 would be incorporate healthy fats. And this includes fats from whole, real foods versus processed foods. And that's a great start. And I also like that they mention variety. Variety in fats is a good thing. I also like the emphasis on using olive oil as a primary added fat. But it was interesting that their second option suggestion was butter or tallow. I mean, that is real fat, but I would say put a greater emphasis after olive oil on adding avocado oil, nuts, and seeds as added fats, and having butter and maybe tallow as that last thing on the list. Because what you'll notice too, within those same recommendations, they say, yeah, variety and definitely add that butter too, but limit your saturated fat to 10%. And that sounds like a lot, but if you're on a 2,000 calorie diet, that's only 22 grams of saturated fat. And ooh, wow, that sounds like a lot. But let's say you had those 3 servings of dairy, that's 15 grams of saturated fat right there. If you add a burger of some sort, you're going to add anywhere from 8 to 10. You've hit your limit right there. You have red meat once, you have your 3 servings of dairy. So better watch out with that butter, better watch out with these other saturated fat sources. So that's why, again, there's some confusion of go crazy on these saturated fats like red meat and whole milk and all that and cheese, including those 3 servings of dairy, but then wait a minute, you got to limit it to 10%. So again, let's step back. Let's look at, okay, yes, that variety in protein is important. It can include some red meat, but also chicken, plant sources of protein, having mostly monounsaturated fats. I think it's also good that they encouraged or discouraged, I should say, processed foods that have a lot of those processed vegetable oils. Those are important to avoid, especially. So there are some good pieces of information in there, but you can see where some of that confusion occurs. So overall with fats, again, added fats is olive oil. Secondary, maybe nuts and seeds, avocado oil. And yes, using butter or tallow in smaller amounts. And then when you're having meats, that you have more lean meats when it comes to saturated fat, but also having fish and all these plant sources of protein as well. So variety really serves a purpose here. Finally, number 7, we're bringing up that limit of highly processed foods, added sugars, and refined carbohydrates. And within this principle, they do encourage prioritize the nutrient-dense foods and home-prepared meals, and limiting those foods that include artificial flavors, petroleum-based dyes, artificial preservatives, and low-calorie, non-nutritive, or artificial sweeteners, and limiting added sugars. And they also include an explanation of what added sugars are. So I feel this is a great recommendation, but again, it falls short in just how many of our chemicals even come from the way that foods are grown, and the importance of organic in a lot of the foods that we eat, including whole grains, including oats, and including a lot of our plants, like legumes, hummus. All of those are high in glyphosate. So a little bit there where we could tend to encourage more organic foods. And here's another controversy, though. Why should we have to buy organic? This is why there needs to be a shift in the way foods are farmed. Organic foods are very expensive, and it tends to create this system where only those that have a higher income can most often afford organic foods or foods lower in chemicals. And chemical-free food is a right for everyone. We are all taxpayers, all of us, and we have the right to have affordable options. So easy to say to avoid a lot of these chemicals in foods, but we really need, or I should say, the government needs to be doing its part on changing the way food is grown and stand up against big ag and the control they have around that process. So quite an issue there, I think, because it's terrible that we do have to encourage organic when we should be able to go to the store knowing that our fresh produce or foods are chemical free, or at least very low in chemicals. And then finally, Principle 8, limit alcoholic beverages. Less is better. I do think it's a better message, although some people do need a limit. Less is better is kind of vague, even though it's true. Some people need that limit. And they also include that note on sodium guidelines as usual, watching your sodium intake. So overall, I've really unpacked a lot here. A lot of back and forth with what's good, what's bad, what's controversial about these new dietary guidelines. And I want to leave you with at least some clarity on what are the next steps and what are the next steps for you. And I think the first thing that we can always come back to is our gut health. And so when we think of our microbiome, remember that our microbiome is central to our health. It is I wouldn't say cause, but it really is the start of a lot of chronic disease, including cardiovascular disease, diabetes, our brain health, our overall sense of well-being. So if we bring it back to the gut, let's really think about what does that mean. And first off, like I talked about, vegetables should be the biggest component of what you eat. So if I were to have that inverted pyramid, I probably would have had vegetables all the way across. And that includes starch, especially the non-starch, but some of those starchy vegetables too. And then maybe you have those protein and fats. So maybe you look at each meal instead of looking at an inverted pyramid. Let's think about your plate. So if I were to think about my plate, that I would have 4 components. Do I have a good portion of vegetables and or some fruit? Do I have some protein? Do I have some good fats? And do I have a complex carbohydrate? And the amount of carbohydrate definitely varies person to person, as does protein. But is it complex and high in fiber most of the time and low in sugar and not processed? So that could either be from a grain that you tolerate, or it can be from a starchy vegetable like potato or sweet potato, or butternut squash. So again, those 4 components, and then really looking at the quality. And oh, by the way, where would dairy fall? I actually include dairy in with protein, because essentially it does provide calcium, but it is a source of protein when you have yogurt or cheese. So, and especially if you are intolerant to dairy and you don't include dairy in your diet, well, you'll take care of your protein needs with other forms of protein. So know that there's this emphasis on vegetables then, and that portion of protein is in moderation, and depending on your growth stage or your needs. And the good fats, emphasizing olive oil, getting these other types of fats from nuts and seeds, other plants, but you will get some saturated fats from the meats and the dairy that you eat, and that's okay, because we do need some saturated fat. Also, moving on to real food versus processed food. Those are all good things that we can keep in mind. So from these guidelines, moving back to this, is that emphasis of let's cut down those ultra processed foods. Let's increase real food, whole food. Let's look at the balance on our plate each meal. That's going to help us feel better, meet our needs. It's going to keep our blood sugar more stable throughout the day, and we function and focus better as well. And as for the influence that might be out there from big ag or big pharma, really, you have power in your purchase. And what you choose to buy on a daily basis is where the money follows. So whatever you can do to be more mindful of your purchases and even find places where organic can be more affordable. I tend to buy in bulk at Costco, a lot of my organic foods. It's also great if you can garden, even just grow a few vegetables, even have a tomato plant. I think that the more we can connect kids to good, real food at a younger age, the better. It's the reason I had started a school garden at my kids' elementary school. What I noticed is kids were going home to their parents and asking them if they could go to the store with them to pick out some fruits and vegetables. Or they would talk about the broccoli that they love, and a parent would tell me, my kid never liked broccoli before. I don't know why they like it now just because they saw it in the garden. So I think if we can also educate our kids about good food, I think that it's an uphill battle if they don't have an understanding of nutrition and the microbiome. They need some incentive for making choices. We can't just tell them how to eat. They want to know why. Kids want to know why as well. They're going to argue about it. Kids are never too young to learn about why they need to eat certain foods and why it's important for their health. So I do think it needs to be an important part of our education system. We spend a lot of time on history and memorizing dates and all this kind of thing, and people come out knowing nothing about their health, knowing nothing about self-care or coping. I just think we have a lot of things backwards. And there is hope. I see school gardens popping up more at schools. So I am encouraged that we are really heading in the right direction. But if your school doesn't have something like that, speak to your PTA, speak to your schools about the way that we can encourage healthy eating. Start talking about what foods are being served at the school lunch program, because our taxes pay for that. And most of us find we have to pack our own lunches because the options aren't healthy enough for our kids. So there's so many different ways that we can make small changes, and know that changes are always done gradually. And that's what I talked about in a previous episode. When I talked about fiber maxing, I talked about steps need to be made slowly, one at a time. Don't feel like you have to take on all of these changes in one day or even 1 week. It's about, let's look at one thing. Let's look at one guideline, one thing that we can change this week or this month, because it's really about creating long-term change. And that requires gradual changes. It sometimes requires addressing picky eating. And so we really want to try again to get our kids' taste buds adjusted if they're used to ultra-processed foods. So perfection is not the goal. That's one thing I always like to say. This does not mean you can never have a piece of candy again or a potato chip again, but they should just be a very small part of what anyone eats. It's more like an occasional food or a food for celebration. But it's not something that should be served on the side with every single meal that you eat. So I hope that leaves you with some food for thought, really to look at your own balance within your own family, making those changes that are more obvious, that will make a more difference in your health, especially first addressing those highly processed foods, going online to try to find the help for easy cooking methods, because there's a lot out there. There's a lot of ideas online for quick, easy cooking, and I'm a big supporter of that one. So love to hear your thoughts about our discussion today. I know we unpacked a lot. So any questions, any thoughts, please share them on the comments below. And if you're not watching on YouTube, please head on over there and you can add a comment there to keep this conversation going. And until next time, be well.